In the vast tapestry of medieval history, few figures command attention quite like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her name echoes through the corridors of time, whispered in the same breath as legendary queens and warrior women who defied the constraints of their age. She was not merely a queen, but a force of nature who wielded power with the skill of a master diplomat, the courage of a crusading knight, and the wisdom of a seasoned politician. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the extraordinary life of a woman who ruled not once, but twice, first as Queen of France, then as Queen of England. Her story is one of political intrigue, passionate love affairs, bitter betrayals, and ultimate triumph. From the sun-drenched vineyards of Aquitaine to the cold stone walls of English castles, from the dusty roads of the Holy Land to the treacherous courts of medieval Europe, Eleanor's influence stretched across continents and centuries. This is not simply the tale of a consort lost in her husband's shadow. This is the story of a woman who commanded armies, orchestrated rebellions, shaped the very concept of courtly love, and whose bloodline would flow through the veins of European royalty for generations to come. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a queen who refused to be silenced, a mother who would see her sons crowned kings, and a woman whose legacy would outlive empires. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to journey back 9 centuries to witness the rise of one of history's most remarkable women. This is the complete story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen, Crusader, Rebel, and the woman who changed the face of medieval Europe forever. Chapter 1. The Golden Duchy. Eleanor's early years, 1122 to 1137. The world into which Eleanor was born, the year 1122, marked the dawn of what would become one of medieval Europe's most turbulent centuries. It was an age of crusading fervor, where knights donned crosses and rode east to reclaim the Holy Land. It was a time of emerging universities, where scholars debated theology and philosophy in the halls of Paris and Bologna. It was an era of expanding trade, where merchants carried silk and spices along ancient routes that connected Europe to the far reaches of Asia. Into this dynamic world was born Eleanor of Aquitaine, around the year 1122. Though, like many medieval births, the exact date remains shrouded in uncertainty. Her birthplace was likely the ducal palace in Poitiers, the glittering capital of Aquitaine, though some chronicles suggest she may have been born in Bordeaux, or even at the castle of Bellin. What is certain is that she entered the world as the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful nobles in Western Europe. The Duchy of Aquitaine was no ordinary realm, stretching from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Massif Central in the east. It encompassed nearly a third of what we now know as France. This vast territory was not merely large, it was extraordinarily wealthy. The region's fertile valleys produced abundant crops, its vineyards yielded wines that were already becoming legendary, and its strategic position along the Atlantic coast made it a crucial hub for international trade. The duchy included not only Aquitaine proper, but also Poitou, Gascony, and various other territories that acknowledged the Duke of Aquitaine as their overlord. The court at Poitiers rivaled Paris in its splendor, and in many ways surpassed it in cultural sophistication. While the northern French courts were often characterized by austere piety and military practicism, the courts of the south embraced art, music, poetry, and learning with an enthusiasm that would profoundly shape Eleanor's character. The House of Aquitaine, a legacy of independence. Eleanor's family, the House of Poitiers, had ruled Aquitaine for over 3 centuries. By the time of her birth, they were descended from Ranulph I, who had established the dynasty in the 9th century, and their lineage was studded with remarkable figures who had shaped the political and cultural landscape of southern France. Her great-grandfather, William VIII, had been known as the Pilgrim for his devotion to religious journeys, particularly to Santiago de Compostela. Her grandfather, William IX, had been perhaps the most colorful of her ancestors, a warrior, a poet, and the first known troubadour. William IX had scandalized the church with his irreverent verses and his numerous love affairs, but he had also elevated the court of Aquitaine to new heights of cultural achievement. His poems, written in the emerging Occitan language, celebrated courtly love and chivalric ideals that would profoundly influence European literature for centuries to come. Eleanor's father, William X, inherited both the duchy and the family tradition of independence. He was a man of considerable political acumen who managed to maintain Aquitaine's autonomy, while navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. The duchy was technically a fief of the French crown, but in practice William X ruled as an independent sovereign, owing only nominal allegiance to King Louis VI of France. William X was also a patron of learning and the arts. Under his rule, the court at Poitiers became a magnet for scholars, poets, and artists from across Europe. The emerging universities of the 12th century found generous support in Aquitaine, and the duchy became renowned for its libraries, schools, and centers of learning. This intellectual atmosphere would prove crucial in shaping Eleanor's remarkably comprehensive education. Eleanor's education, an exceptional foundation in an age when most noble girls received only rudimentary education focused on domestic skills and basic religious instruction. Eleanor's upbringing was extraordinarily comprehensive. Her father, recognizing that she might one day inherit the duchy, ensured that she received the education typically reserved for male heirs. Eleanor's tutors were among the finest scholars of the age. She learned to read and write not only in her native Occitan, but also in Latin, the universal language of learning and diplomacy. Her Latin education was thorough enough that she could read the classical authors Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero, as well as contemporary theological and philosophical works. This classical foundation would serve her well throughout her life, allowing her to engage with the intellectual currents of her time and to communicate effectively with scholars and churchmen across Europe. Mathematics and astronomy were part of her curriculum, reflecting the growing importance of these subjects in medieval education. She studied music not merely as an ornament to her character, but as a serious intellectual discipline, learning both theory and practice. The court at Poitiers was renowned for its musical traditions, and Eleanor became an accomplished performer on several instruments. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor received extensive training in what we might call political science. She studied law, both canon and civil, learning the complex legal frameworks that governed medieval society. She was taught the art of diplomacy, studying the intricate relationships between the various kingdoms, duchies, and ecclesiastical territories that made up the medieval world. She learned the principles of estate management, understanding how to govern territories, collect taxes, and maintain the complex feudal relationships that held her father's realm together. Her education also included what we might call cultural studies. She learned the genealogies of the great noble houses of Europe, understanding the web of relationships, alliances, and enmities that shaped medieval politics. She studied heraldry, protocol, and the elaborate ceremonial traditions that were so important in medieval court life. Physical education was not neglected. Eleanor learned to ride not merely the sedate pacing expected of noble ladies, but the skilled horsemanship necessary for hunting and, if needed, warfare. She was taught to hunt with hawks and hounds, skills that were not only recreational but also important for understanding military tactics and for participating in the political negotiations that often took place during hunting expeditions. The cultural renaissance of 12th century Aquitaine, the Aquitaine of Eleanor's youth, was experiencing what historians have called the 12th century Renaissance, a flowering of learning, art, and culture that prefigured the more famous Renaissance of the 15th century. The duchy's strategic position at the crossroads of European trade routes made it a meeting place for ideas from across the known world. The court at Poitiers attracted troubadours from across southern France and northern Spain. These poet-musicians were developing new forms of lyric poetry that celebrated refined love, chivalric virtue, and courtly elegance. Their influence on Eleanor would be profound, and she would later become one of the great patronesses of troubadour culture. Scholars from the emerging universities found welcome at William X's court. The University of Paris was just beginning to establish its reputation, and many of its students and masters traveled south to participate in the intellectual life of Aquitaine. The result was a remarkable synthesis of northern scholasticism and southern cultural refinement that would characterize Eleanor's worldview throughout her life. The church in Aquitaine was also distinctive. While maintaining orthodox theology, the southern French church embraced a more relaxed attitude toward learning and culture than was common in northern France. Monasteries like Saint Martial in Limoges became centers of manuscript production and scholarship. The pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, which passed through the heart of Aquitaine, brought a constant stream of travelers who carried news, ideas, and cultural influences from across Europe. Trade was another crucial factor in cultural development. The duchy's ports, particularly Bordeaux and La Rochelle, were major centers of international commerce. Ships arrived carrying goods from England, Flanders, the Mediterranean, and even the distant East. With these goods came ideas, stories, and cultural influences that enriched the intellectual life of the duchy. The question of succession as Eleanor grew into adolescence, the question of succession became increasingly important. William X had no legitimate male heir, and while he had acknowledged several illegitimate sons, medieval inheritance law was clear that Eleanor, as his eldest legitimate child, was his primary heir. This was not unusual in Aquitaine, where women had historically enjoyed greater legal rights than in many other parts of Europe, but it did create political complications. The prospect of a young woman inheriting one of Europe's most powerful duchies attracted the attention of every major political player on the continent. Eleanor was not merely an heiress, she was the greatest prize in the medieval marriage market. Control of Aquitaine through marriage to Eleanor would instantly make any prince or king one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. King Louis VI of France, known as Louis the Fat, was particularly interested in securing Eleanor's hand for his son, the future Louis VII. The union would bring Aquitaine under direct French royal control, effectively doubling the size of the French royal domain. However, other suitors were also considering their options. The Holy Roman Emperor might seek to arrange a marriage with one of his relatives. The English king might propose an alliance, or one of the other great French nobles might attempt to win Eleanor's hand. William X was well aware of these political calculations, and he carefully considered his options for his daughter's future. He wanted to ensure that Aquitaine would remain as independent as possible, while also securing Eleanor's personal safety and political position. The solution he eventually chose would prove to be one of the most momentous decisions in medieval European history: the pilgrimage and the end of an era. In 1137, William X made a decision that would change the course of European history. At the age of 38, he announced his intention to undertake a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, following in the footsteps of his ancestors who had made this sacred journey. Medieval pilgrimages were often undertaken for complex motivation, devotion certainly, but also political calculation, personal penance, or simple adventure. For William X, the pilgrimage may have served multiple purposes. He was a deeply religious man who had long planned to make the journey to the shrine of St. James. But the pilgrimage also provided an opportunity to consider his daughter's future away from the pressures of court life and to perhaps seek divine guidance on the crucial decisions that lay ahead. Before departing, William X made careful arrangements for the governance of the duchy during his absence. He appointed trusted advisors to oversee daily administration and made provisions for Eleanor's continued education and protection. Most importantly, he composed a will that would determine Eleanor's fate if anything should happen to him during the journey. The pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela was well established by the 12th century, but it was not without dangers. Travelers faced the risks of disease, bandits, accidents, and the general hazards of medieval travel. William X's party followed the traditional route through the heart of France and into northern Spain, stopping at the great pilgrimage churches along the way. The journey proceeded normally until the party reached the vicinity of Santiago de Compostela. There, in the spring of 1137, William X fell suddenly ill. Medieval medicine could do little for him, and within days, he was dead. The news of his death sent shockwaves throughout Europe, but nowhere more than in Aquitaine, where the 15-year-old Eleanor had just become one of the most powerful women in Christendom. The inheritance: Eleanor becomes Duchess. The death of William X thrust Eleanor into a position of unprecedented power and responsibility. At an age when most noble girls were just beginning to think about marriage, she found herself the ruler of a territory larger and richer than most kingdoms. The duchy she inherited included not only Aquitaine proper, but also Poitou, Gascony, and various other territories, a realm that stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees and from the Atlantic to the Massif Central. The practical implications of her inheritance were staggering. Eleanor was now responsible for governing millions of subjects, maintaining complex feudal relationships with dozens of subordinate nobles, collecting taxes, administering justice, and defending her territories against potential aggressors. The duchy's annual revenues were enormous by medieval standards, derived from agricultural production, international trade, and feudal obligations. But Eleanor's inheritance also made her an immediate target. As an unmarried young woman ruling one of Europe's most valuable territories, she represented both an enormous opportunity and a significant threat to the established political order. Every unmarried prince in Europe would now see her as the ultimate prize, while married kings would view her as a potential threat to their own power. The terms of William II's will reflected his understanding of these realities, recognizing that Eleanor could not long remain unmarried and that her choice of husband would determine Aquitaine's political future. He had made provisions for her guardianship that would strongly influence her marital prospects. In a decision that would reshape European politics, William I had entrusted Eleanor's guardianship to King Louis VI of France. This arrangement was both politically astute and personally protective. By placing Eleanor under royal protection, William I ensured that she would be safe from kidnapping or forced marriage, constant threats to wealthy heiresses in the medieval world. At the same time, he had virtually guaranteed that Eleanor would marry into the French royal family, most likely to Louis VI's son and heir, the future Louis VII. The rapid courtship King Louis VI wasted no time in acting upon his guardianship of Eleanor. Within weeks of receiving news of William II's death, he had dispatched his son Louis to Aquitaine with a substantial retinue and clear instructions to secure Eleanor's hand in marriage as quickly as possible. The young Louis, who would later become Louis VII of France, was about 17 years old at the time, only 2 years older than Eleanor. He had been raised in a court that valued piety, scholarship, and military prowess, but he had little experience with the more sophisticated cultural traditions of southern France, where Eleanor had been educated in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom and cultural refinement. Louis had been shaped by the austere traditions of northern French monarchy. Despite these differences in background and temperament, the political logic of the marriage was overwhelming. For France, the union would bring the vast territories of Aquitaine under royal control, effectively doubling the size of the French kingdom. For Eleanor, marriage to the heir to the French throne would provide the protection and political alliance necessary to maintain her independence and authority. The courtship was brief and formal. Louis arrived in Poitiers in the summer of 1137, and within days, arrangements for the marriage had been finalized. Eleanor, despite her youth, would have understood the political necessity of the union, and there is no evidence that she resisted the match. Indeed, given the alternatives: potential kidnapping, forced marriage to a less suitable partner, or the gradual erosion of her authority, marriage to the French heir may have seemed like her best option. The wedding of the century on July 25, 1137, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis of France were married in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. The ceremony was magnificent, even by medieval standards, with representatives from across Europe in attendance. The wedding was not merely a personal union, but a geopolitical event that would reshape the balance of power in Western Europe. Eleanor wore the traditional bridal attire of medieval nobility, a richly embroidered gown, a golden circlet upon her head, and jewelry that displayed the wealth and power of Aquitaine. Louis appeared in the ceremonial dress of French royalty, but the contrast between the bride and groom was already apparent to observers. Eleanor radiated confidence and sophistication, while Louis seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion and the magnitude of what was taking place. The wedding celebration lasted for several days, featuring tournaments, feasts, musical performances, and elaborate pageantry. Troubadours composed special songs for the occasion, and the greatest nobles of France and Aquitaine came to pay their respects to the new duchess and her husband. The celebration was a deliberate display of power and wealth, intended to announce to all of Europe that a new political reality had been created. But even as the celebration continued, events were unfolding that would soon thrust Eleanor into an even more elevated position. King Louis VI, whose health had been declining for several months, was on his deathbed in Paris. On August 1, 1137, just 1 week after Eleanor's wedding, the old king died, and her new husband ascended the throne as Louis VII of France. At the age of 15, Eleanor of Aquitaine had become Queen of France. Chapter 2. The Young Queen of France, 1137 to 1147, ascending to the throne. The death of Louis VI on August 1, 1137, transformed Eleanor from a powerful duchess into one of the most influential women in Christendom, virtually overnight. As Queen of France, she now found herself at the heart of the most important royal court in Western Europe, wielding influence that extended far beyond her own Duchy of Aquitaine. The transition from the court of Poitiers to the royal court in Paris represented a dramatic shift in Eleanor's life, where Aquitaine had been characterized by cultural sophistication, intellectual freedom, and a relatively relaxed approach to courtly life. The French royal court was formal, hierarchical, and dominated by religious ceremony. The difference was immediately apparent in everything from daily routines to architectural styles. The royal palace in Paris, though impressive, lacked the refined elegance that Eleanor had known in Poitiers. The court was dominated by churchmen and northern French nobles who viewed the more liberal attitudes of the south with suspicion. Where Eleanor had been accustomed to participating freely in intellectual discussions and cultural activities, she now found herself expected to conform to the more restricted role traditionally assigned to French queens. Louis VII, now 20 years old and thrust into kingship earlier than expected, was struggling with his own transition to royal authority. He had been educated for leadership, but his temperament was more suited to scholarship or religious life than to the practical demands of medieval kingship. Deeply pious, intellectually inclined, and personally modest, Louis represented the ideal of Christian kingship as conceived by medieval theorists, but he lacked the political cunning and decisive leadership that effective rule often required. The cultural clash, the marriage between Eleanor and Louis VII quickly revealed fundamental differences in personality, values, and vision that would plague their relationship throughout their 15-year union. These differences reflected not only their individual characters, but also the broader cultural divide between northern and southern France that would shape medieval European politics for centuries. Eleanor brought to the French court the cultural sophistication of Aquitaine and appreciation for music, poetry, intellectual discourse, and refined courtly behavior. She was accustomed to expressing her opinions freely, participating in political discussions, and maintaining an active role in governance. Her education had prepared her to be a ruler in her own right, not merely a consort to a king. Louis, by contrast, had been raised in a tradition that emphasized royal dignity, religious devotion, and hierarchical order. The French royal court of the early 12th century was characterized by ceremony, formality, and a clear distinction between the roles of men and women. Queens were expected to be pious, modest, and primarily focused on their roles as wives and mothers. The contrast was immediately visible in their approach to court life. Eleanor introduced southern French customs to Paris, including more elaborate clothing, refined musical entertainment, and a greater emphasis on courtly ceremony. She surrounded herself with poets, musicians, and scholars from Aquitaine, creating what amounted to a cultural outpost of the south within the northern French court. Many of the established courtiers viewed these innovations with suspicion or outright hostility. They saw Eleanor's cultural initiatives as frivolous distractions from the serious business of government and church affairs. Some questioned whether her relatively liberal attitudes were appropriate for a French queen, and rumors began to circulate about her unseemly behavior and foreign influences. Eleanor's political influence, despite the cultural tensions surrounding her presence at court, Eleanor quickly established herself as a significant political force in the French kingdom. Her position as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right meant that she brought to the marriage not only her person, but also the loyalty and resources of one of Europe's most powerful territories. This gave her a degree of independence and influence that was unusual for medieval queens. Eleanor's political involvement took several forms. First, she served as Louis VII's primary advisor on matters concerning southern France. Her deep understanding of Aquitanian politics, her network of relationships among the southern nobility, and her knowledge of the region's economic and military resources made her invaluable in formulating royal policy toward the south. Second, Eleanor played an active role in diplomatic affairs. Her education in languages, law, and protocol made her an effective negotiator, and her position as both queen and duchess gave her unique standing in international relations. She participated in correspondence with foreign rulers, received diplomatic missions, and helped formulate French foreign policy. Third, Eleanor took an active interest in the administration of royal finances. The wealth of Aquitaine significantly increased the resources available to the French crown, but managing these resources effectively required someone who understood the complex economic relationships that governed the duchy. Eleanor's involvement in financial administration was both practical and political. She wanted to ensure that Aquitanian resources were used effectively while also maintaining her duchy's distinct interests. The question of heirs. One of the most pressing concerns for any medieval royal marriage was the production of heirs, and this became an increasingly urgent issue for Eleanor and Louis VII as their marriage progressed. The stability of the French monarchy depended on a clear line of succession, and the political alliance between France and Aquitaine could only be permanently secured through children who would inherit both realms. For the first several years of their marriage, Eleanor failed to conceive, a situation that caused considerable anxiety at court and provided ammunition for her critics. Medieval medical understanding attributed fertility problems to various causes, but there was always the possibility that a marriage might be declared invalid on grounds of divine displeasure or consanguinity blood relationship if it failed to produce children. The pressure on Eleanor to produce an heir was intensified by the political implications of childlessness. If she died without children, Aquitaine would pass to her sister, Petronilla, or other relatives, potentially severing the connection between the duchy and the French crown that had been the primary purpose of her marriage to Louis. Finally, in 1145, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Marie. While the birth of a female heir was not ideal from the perspective of medieval succession law, it at least demonstrated that the royal couple could produce children. Marie's birth also strengthened Eleanor's position at court by fulfilling one of the primary expectations for medieval queens. 2 years later, in 1147, Eleanor gave birth to a second daughter, Alix, while 2 daughters still left the succession question somewhat uncertain. Their births established Eleanor as a mother and strengthened her claims to respect and authority within the royal family. Religious and cultural patronage. As Queen of France, Eleanor used her position and resources to become one of the most important cultural patronesses of the 12th century. Her support for religious institutions, educational endeavors, and artistic projects reflected both her personal interests and her understanding of the political importance of cultural leadership. Eleanor's religious patronage followed the tradition established by previous French queens, but with distinctive characteristics that reflected her southern French background. She supported monasteries and churches throughout France, but she showed particular favor to religious institutions that emphasized learning and cultural achievement. The Abbey of Saint Denis, already favored by the French monarchy, received her support, but she also directed resources toward religious houses in Aquitaine that were developing new approaches to monastic life and scholarship. Her cultural patronage was even more distinctive. Eleanor actively encouraged the development of what would become known as the courtly love tradition, a literary and cultural movement that celebrated refined romantic relationships and chivalric ideals. This movement, which had its roots in the troubadour poetry of her grandfather William IX, would profoundly influence European literature and social customs for centuries. Eleanor's court became a gathering place for poets, musicians, and scholars from across Europe. She commissioned literary works, supported the development of new musical forms, and encouraged the translation of classical and contemporary texts into vernacular languages. Her cultural program was not merely ornamental, it was a deliberate effort to establish French cultural leadership in Europe and to demonstrate the sophistication and refinement of her court. Military and political challenges. The early years of Louis VII's reign were marked by several military and political challenges that tested both his leadership abilities and Eleanor's political acumen. The most significant of these was the conflict with Theobald IV, Count of Champagne, which arose from a dispute over the succession to the county of Toulouse. Eleanor had hereditary claims to Toulouse through her grandfather, and she pressed Louis to support these claims militarily. The resulting campaign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the royal couple's partnership. Eleanor's knowledge of southern French politics and her network of alliances proved valuable in organizing the campaign, but Louis's hesitant leadership and the resistance of other French nobles limited its success. The Toulouse campaign also highlighted the ongoing tension between Eleanor's interests as Duchess of Aquitaine and Louis's responsibilities as King of France. While Eleanor naturally wanted to expand her southern territories, Louis had to consider the impact of such expansion on his relationships with other French nobles and foreign powers. Another significant challenge came from the church hierarchy, particularly from the influential abbot, Suger of St. Denis, and other ecclesiastical leaders who viewed some of Eleanor's cultural innovations with suspicion. These churchmen worried that the elaborate courtly ceremonies and literary celebrations of romantic love that Eleanor promoted might distract from proper religious devotion or even encourage immoral behavior. The seeds of discontent by the mid-1140s, the fundamental incompatibilities between Eleanor and Louis VII, were becoming increasingly apparent to both themselves and their courtiers. While they had successfully produced 2 daughters and had managed to work together on various political and administrative matters, their personal relationship remained troubled by deep differences in temperament and vision. Eleanor found Louis's piety admirable but excessive, his caution prudent but paralyzing, and his deference to church authority appropriate but limiting. She had been raised to expect active participation in governance and decision-making, but she found herself increasingly marginalized as Louis relied more heavily on male advisors and church officials. Louis, for his part, found Eleanor's independence troubling, her cultural interests frivolous, and her political ambitions inappropriate for a queen. He valued her intelligence and respected her administrative abilities, but he was uncomfortable with her public presence and her influence over court culture. These personal tensions were exacerbated by political pressures. Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir continued to be a source of anxiety, and some courtiers began to suggest that the royal marriage might be reconsidered if the succession problem could not be resolved. There were also rumors about Eleanor's relationships with various courtiers and visitors, rumors that reflected both medieval misogyny and genuine concerns about her unconventional behavior by the standards of the time. The call to crusade in 1145. Events in the Eastern Mediterranean would provide the catalyst for the next phase of Eleanor's extraordinary life. The Crusader state of Edessa had fallen to Muslim forces under Zengi, the ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, marking the first major territorial loss for the Crusaders since the establishment of the Latin states in the East. Following the First Crusade, the fall of Edessa sent shockwaves throughout Western Europe and prompted Pope Eugenius III to call for a new crusade to reclaim the lost territory and secure the remaining Crusader states. The papal call found its most influential supporter in Bernard of Clairvaux, the charismatic Cistercian abbot, whose preaching had made him one of the most respected religious figures in Europe. Bernard's call for crusade reached the French court at a time when Louis VII was seeking to establish his reputation as a capable and pious king. The young monarch had struggled with various domestic challenges and had not yet achieved the kind of dramatic success that would establish his authority. Beyond question, a successful crusade would provide an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership abilities while also fulfilling his religious obligations as a Christian king. For Eleanor, the call to crusade presented both an opportunity and a challenge. As Queen of France, she would be expected to support her husband's decision to take the cross, but her own role in any crusading expedition was uncertain. Medieval precedent offered few examples of queens participating directly in crusading warfare, and the practical challenges of organizing and financing such an expedition would be enormous. However, Eleanor saw in the proposed crusade something more than just a religious obligation or political opportunity. She saw a chance to escape the constraints of the French court, to demonstrate her own leadership abilities, and to participate in what promised to be one of the great adventures of the age. Her decision to take the cross alongside her husband would shock medieval Europe and establish her as one of the most remarkable women of her time. Chapter 3. The Crusading Queen, 1147 to 1149. Preparing for the greatest adventure when Pope Eugenius III issued his call for the Second Crusade in December 1145, he envisioned armies of Western knights marching east to reclaim the lost Crusader territories. What he probably did not anticipate was that one of the most prominent participants would be a queen, who would insist on leading her own contingent of warriors from one of Europe's most powerful duchies. Eleanor's decision to take the cross and participate personally in the Second Crusade was unprecedented in the history of medieval queenship. While noble women had occasionally participated in earlier crusades, no queen had ever organized and led her own military contingent on such a scale. Her announcement that she would accompany Louis VII to the Holy Land, bringing with her hundreds of knights and soldiers from Aquitaine, sent shockwaves throughout Europe and established her as one of the most remarkable figures of her age. The decision reflected several aspects of Eleanor's character and circumstances. First, her education and upbringing in Aquitaine had given her a more expansive view of women's roles than was common in northern France. The tradition of strong duchesses in her family, combined with the relatively liberal attitudes of southern French culture, had prepared her to think of herself as a ruler in her own right, rather than merely a royal consort. Second, Eleanor's position as Duchess of Aquitaine gave her the independent resources necessary to organize a major military expedition. Unlike other queens who would have had to rely entirely on their husbands' resources, Eleanor could draw upon the wealth and military obligations of her own territories to fund and equip her crusading army. Third, the practical politics of the crusade made Eleanor's participation advantageous for the French expedition as a whole. Aquitaine's warriors were renowned for their skill and courage, and the duchy's wealth would be crucial in financing the enormous costs of a major crusading expedition. Eleanor's personal leadership of the Aquitanian contingent would ensure that these resources were fully committed to the cause. The logistics of a royal crusade organizing the Second Crusade required diplomatic, financial, and logistical planning on an unprecedented scale. The expedition would need to transport tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles of often hostile territory, maintain supply lines across multiple kingdoms, and coordinate with the existing Crusader states in the east. Eleanor threw herself into these preparations with characteristic energy and attention to detail. She worked closely with her Aquitanian vassals to organize the military contingent, ensuring that each major noble family contributed its full feudal obligation of knights, men-at-arms, and support personnel. She oversaw the financial arrangements, drawing upon Aquitaine's substantial treasury and negotiating loans from Italian bankers to fund the expedition's enormous costs. The Queen also took responsibility for organizing the participation of women in the crusade. While the majority of the crusading army would consist of male warriors, the expedition also included substantial numbers of women nobles, servants, pilgrims, and others who had various reasons for making the journey to the Holy Land. Eleanor organized these women into a structured group that could travel safely and contribute effectively to the expedition's goals. One of the most controversial aspects of Eleanor's preparation was her decision to equip a group of noble ladies as symbolic warriors. These women, including Eleanor herself, were fitted with specially crafted armor and weapons, though there is no evidence that they intended to participate in actual combat. The symbolic gesture was designed to demonstrate the total commitment of Aquitaine to the crusading cause, but it scandalized many conservative observers who saw it as an inappropriate violation of traditional gender roles. The departure, a magnificent spectacle, the departure of the Second Crusade from France in the spring of 1147 was one of the most spectacular events of the medieval period. The French army, estimated at between 70,000 and 100,000 people, represented the largest military force assembled in Western Europe since the time of Charlemagne. The sight of tens of thousands of warriors, pilgrims, and support personnel streaming out of Paris and across the French countryside was both inspiring and terrifying to contemporary observers. Eleanor's contingent was among the most impressive elements of the crusading army. The Aquitanian warriors were magnificently equipped, their armor and weapons representing the finest craftsmanship available in 12th century Europe. Eleanor herself rode at the head of her forces, wearing specially crafted armor that combined practical protection with the symbolic trappings of royal authority. The Queen's presence at the head of an army was unprecedented, and it attracted attention throughout Europe. Chronicles from the period describe the amazement of observers who witnessed the spectacle of a queen leading warriors to the Holy Land. Some praised her courage and devotion, while others questioned the propriety of such an extraordinary departure from traditional roles. The early stages of the journey proceeded smoothly as the army moved through France and into the Holy Roman Empire. Eleanor's organizational skills proved valuable as the expedition dealt with the complex logistics of moving such a large force across multiple kingdoms. Her diplomatic abilities were also important in negotiating with local rulers for safe passage and supplies. Through Germany, diplomatic challenges, the passage through the Holy Roman Empire presented the first major challenges for the crusading army. Emperor Conrad III had decided to organize his own crusading expedition, and the prospect of two large armies moving through the same territories at roughly the same time created enormous logistical and diplomatic complications. Eleanor played a crucial role in